There is a people that does not fit on the map, not the geographical one, but the historical one. For centuries, we thought we knew who the ancient Egyptians were. We saw their faces on the walls of tombs, read their names on papyri, and counted their kings and queens. We built a history out of this that seemed complete, clean, understandable, almost too simple. And then a fragment of bone appeared. Small, old, silent. And everything we thought began to crack. For generations, the history of ancient Egypt seemed settled. It was told in schools, in museums, in documentary films. A people that emerged on the banks of the Nile. A civilization that rose by itself from the desert, like a flower from a stone. Separate, unique, locked in its own valley, surrounded by sand and sea. This version was convenient. It gave Egypt a clear place in history. It explained its greatness as something internal, as a result of geography and time. The Nile flooded, the earth bore fruit, people built, and from this, pyramids, temples, hieroglyphs, and gods were born. But there was one detail that never fit. The faces on the walls did not always look the same. The names of the kings did not always sound the same. The language had layers that led somewhere far away. Artifacts came from places that officially should not have had a connection with the Nile Valley. And when scientists began to look closely, they saw something that did not fit into a simple scheme. At first, it seemed like an exception. Then, a few exceptions. And then it became clear that there were too many exceptions to ignore them. Ancient Egypt was never an island. It was a crossroads. But to understand this, one had to wait for proof that could not be denied. Proof that does not depend on the interpretation of walls, texts, or traditions. Proof written in the very bodies of those who lived thousands of years ago. Proof written in DNA. For a long time, extracting DNA from Egyptian mummies was considered almost impossible. The heat of the desert, the embalming process, chemicals, time, all of this destroyed the genetic material. Researchers tried, again and again, and again and again. The results were incomplete, unreliable, fragmentary. It seemed that the mummies guarded their secret better than any walls. But technologies changed. Methods became more refined, and one day, a team of researchers obtained what no one had obtained before. Clean, readable genomes extracted from people who lived in ancient Egypt over 3,000 years ago. And what they saw did not fit expectations. The ancient Egyptians whose DNA was successfully read were genetically closer not to modern Egyptians, but to the population of the ancient Near East, to the people who lived in the lands we today call the Levant, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Their ancestors came from the east, from the lands between the seas, from the very regions where the first cities, the first temples, and the first writing systems were born. This did not mean that the Egyptians were strangers in their own land. It meant something much deeper. It meant that the Nile Valley was never isolated, that people, ideas, languages, and genes flowed back and forth for millennia, that the civilization we considered separate was part of a much larger network. The old version was not a mistake, it was a simplification. And this is only the beginning of what DNA showed. Because when researchers compared ancient samples with the modern population of Egypt, they saw a shift. Modern Egyptians have a significantly larger genetic component originating from sub-Saharan Africa than their ancient ancestors from the era of the pharaohs. This component appeared later, through trade, through migrations, through the centuries that followed the fall of the ancient kingdom. This meant something that is difficult to accept at once. That modern Egyptians are not the simple descendants of those who built the pyramids. That between the ancient and modern populations of the Nile Valley, waves of change passed that rewrote the genetic map of the region. And this raised a question that historians asked carefully, almost in a whisper. If the ancient Egyptians came genetically from the Near East, and modern Egyptians have a significant African component, then who really were the people who created this civilization? The answer did not become simpler, it became larger. Because DNA does not tell one story, it tells many stories simultaneously. And in ancient Egypt, these stories intertwined in ways we are only beginning to understand. Imagine the Nile Valley 5,000 years ago. Imagine people coming from the north, from the lands of the Levant, bringing with them livestock, seeds, and technologies. Imagine other people coming from the south, from Nubia, from the lands that are today Sudan, bringing their traditions, their language, and their beliefs. Imagine a third group coming from the west, from the desert that was once a green savanna. Imagine how all these streams meet on the banks of one river, and how from this meeting, something new is born. This was not the civilization of one people. It was a civilization of many peoples who merged into one culture, one language, one religion, one state. And this state called itself Kemet, the Black Land, after the color of the silt that the Nile left behind after flooding. But even the name hid complexity, because Kemet was never homogeneous. In the north, in the delta, people lived differently than in the south, in Upper Egypt. They spoke with different accents, worshipped different gods, and had different burial traditions. The unification of the two lands, which is attributed to the pharaoh Nama around the year 3100 before our era, was not simply a political act. It was the merging of two already complex, already multi-layered worlds. And DNA confirms this. Samples from different regions of Egypt show different genetic profiles, different proportions of ancestors, different histories of migrations. The Nile Valley was never one people. It was a mosaic. But a mosaic has its own logic, and the most amazing thing about this logic is that it connects Egypt with places we rarely think about in the context of the pharaohs. Researchers studying ancient genomes saw genetic connections that stretched to the Neolithic farmers of Anatolia, to the very people who brought agriculture to Europe, to the very lineages that can be found in ancient bones from Greece, from the Balkans, from Central Europe. It turned out that the ancient Egyptians shared deep ancestral ties with a population that inhabited a continent thousands of kilometers away from the Nile. This did not mean that the Egyptians were Europeans, and it did not mean that Europeans were Egyptians. It meant something much more subtle. That during the Neolithic period, when agriculture was just beginning to spread around the world, streams of people moved in all directions, from Anatolia to Europe, from Anatolia to the Levant, from the Levant to Egypt. And these streams left genetic traces that we can only now read. Ancient Egypt did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a world that was already connected, from a world where people moved, traded, married, and mixed, from a world in which the idea of an isolated civilization is an illusion created by the fact that we did not see the connections. Now we see them. But every answer generates new questions. If the ancient Egyptians had such strong Near Eastern roots, what happened to the people who lived in the Nile Valley earlier? To those who were there before the arrival of the farmers? To the hunter-gatherers who walked along the river when the Sahara was still green? Some traces of them remained, in the deep layers of the DNA of modern populations, in the rock paintings that can still be found in corners of the desert where rivers once flowed, in the myths that the Egyptians told about themselves, about the times before times, when gods walked the earth. But most of their history is lost, swallowed by the sand, erased by time, covered by new waves of people who came from the north and east. And this is one of the most moving discoveries, that beneath the civilization of the pharaohs lies another civilization, older, forgotten, barely visible. That the Egypt we know was built on the ruins of an Egypt we will never know. And who knows how many such layers lie even deeper. Imagine the laboratory where this discovery takes place. A quiet room filled with computers, centrifuges, and freezers. Imagine a small fragment of bone, no bigger than a fingernail, lying on a glass stand. This bone is 3,000 years old. It belonged to a person who lived, breathed, loved, worked, and died somewhere in the Nile Valley during the times when megaliths were still being built in Europe and writing was just being born in China. The researcher puts on gloves, takes up an instrument, extracts a microscopic amount of material, places it in a solution, starts the machine, and after a few hours or days or weeks, letters appear on the screen. A, T, G, C. 4 letters of the genetic code, repeating billions of times, forming the genome of a person who died when the world was completely different. And these letters tell a story. They tell where their ancestors came from, where they migrated, who they mixed with, what they passed on to the next generations. They tell a story that this person themselves did not know, but which they carried in every cell of their body. And this story does not fit into one line. It branches out, flows backward in time, diverges into tens of tributaries. Each tributary leads to a different population, to a different migration, to a different moment when 2 people met and the world changed, even if they did not know about it. This is the true history of ancient Egypt, not the history of one civilization, but the history of millions of meetings, not the history of one people, but the history of many peoples who merged into one. And this story forces us to reconsider not only Egypt, because if what we considered an isolated civilization was actually a crossroads, then what can be said about the other great civilizations of antiquity? About Mesopotamia, about India, about China, about Mesoamerica? How much of what we consider unique and separate is actually part of a larger, more complex network of exchanges? DNA does not give us the answers to these questions, yet. But it gives us a tool, and this tool is already beginning to rewrite the history of humanity. The old model was simple. Civilizations emerged separately in their valleys, in their landscapes, and developed along their own paths. Sometimes they contacted each other. Sometimes they traded. Sometimes they fought. But overall, they were separate entities. The new model is more complex. Civilizations emerged from networks, from streams of people, ideas, and genes that moved for millennia before the first cities appeared. What we consider the beginning was actually only the visible tip of a much deeper history. And in this history, there are no pure roots. There is no single people. There is no single lineage. There is only mixing, movement, and meetings that repeat again and again, layer by layer, over tens of thousands of years. This is the true human history. Not a tree with one trunk, but a net. Not a line, but a web. Not an origin, but a constant intertwining. And ancient Egypt is one of the most beautiful confirmations of this truth. Think for a minute about the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built by thousands of people, workers, engineers, sculptors, priests. Each of them had their own genetic history. Each carried within themselves layers of ancestors who came from different places at different times. Each was a living sum of migrations. And when they stacked the stones, they were not just stacking a monument to one pharaoh. They were stacking a monument to the entire chain of human meetings that brought them to this moment, to this valley, to this construction site. The pyramid still stands. The stones still hold. But the people who laid them have long since turned to dust. And all that is left of them are a few bones in a few tombs, a few DNA samples in a few laboratories, a few letters on a screen, that form a story we are only beginning to read. Why do we need to know so much who they were? Perhaps because in their history, we see ourselves. We see our own complexity, our own mixed nature, our own impossibility of being one pure people, with one pure origin, with one pure past. People have always wanted simple stories about themselves. They wanted to know where they came from. They wanted to have clear roots, clear lines, clear boundaries. But the true history is different. The true history is always more complex than we want. It always shows that we come not from one place, but from many, that our ancestors moved, mixed, met with those they did not know, and made children who became our great-great-grandparents. We are all the product of these meetings. Every person breathing today carries within themselves the traces of tens of migrations, hundreds of peoples, thousands of generations. We are living networks, walking mosaics. And the ancient Egyptians were just the same. They were not who we thought they were. Not because we were completely wrong, but because our picture was too small. They were larger. They were the product of a world that existed long before them. A world in which people were already traveling from Anatolia to the Nile, from the Levant to the Sahara, from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. A world in which isolation was a myth and connections were reality. And when they stood on the banks of the Nile, looking at the water that brought life, they did not know that they carried within themselves a history that stretched across half the world. They simply lived, built, prayed, loved, died, just like us. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of this discovery, that there is not as great a distance between us and the ancient Egyptians as it seems, that we are both products of the exact same processes, migrations that never stop, meetings that never end, mixings that always continue. History did not end in ancient Egypt. It did not end in Rome. It did not end in the Middle Ages. It continues now, in us, in our bodies, in our children. Every new generation adds a new layer to the mosaic. Every new marriage between people from different countries writes a new line in the genetic book of humanity. Perhaps, in 3,000 years, someone will study our bones, extract our DNA, look at the letters on the screen, and see that we too were not who we thought we were. That our stories about ourselves were too small. That we too were a mosaic, a network, a web of ancestors we never knew. And perhaps that researcher in 3,000 years will feel the same thing we feel looking at the ancient Egyptians. Quiet respect, amazement, the realization that history is always larger than we think, that beneath every simple answer lies a more complex one, that beneath every more complex one lies an even more complex one, and so on to the very origins, which perhaps we will never fully see. The ancient Egyptians are silent. Their mummies lie in museums. Their pyramids stand on the plateau. Their inscriptions look at us from the walls. They can no longer tell us who they were, but their bones tell the story, quietly, patiently, through the letters A, T, G, C, which form a story that none of them could have known, because it was larger than any individual life, larger than any individual dynasty, larger than any individual civilization. They were a crossroads. They were a mosaic. They were a network that stretched across centuries and continents to times when there were no cities yet, no writing, no kings. They were people, like us, complex, mixed, multi-layered. And perhaps this is the most beautiful truth that DNA has given us. Not a new answer, but a new question. Not the closing of a mystery, but its expansion. Because now, when we look at the faces on the walls of the tombs, We do not see one people. We see thousands. We see millions.
We see the entire chain of human meetings that brought these people here, to this valley, at this time, to this moment when the artist raised the brush and began to paint their features on the stone. And that stone still stands. And we stand before it, 3,000 years later, with our DNA, with our ancestors, with our own mosaic inside, and begin to understand that we are not so far from them after all. They were not who we thought they were, not because the old history was completely wrong, but because it was too small. And the true history, the one that is now being revealed through the genetic code, is not simpler. It is older, deeper, more intertwined, more human. The mystery was not solved. It was expanded. And perhaps it is exactly in this expansion that the true beauty of the past lives. Not in simple answers, not in clean lines, but in the endless network that connects us all, through time, through space, through the letters written in our cells, with those who lived thousands of years ago on the banks of a river that still flows. The Nile still flows. And the ancient Egyptians, whoever they were, wherever they came from, still look at us from their walls, silently reminding us that history is never as simple as we want, that it is always larger, always older, always more mysterious. And perhaps that is exactly why we will never stop searching for it.